The theater lights had gone out long ago, and the crowd that once filled the seats with chatter and applause had already left. The place was quiet now, almost too quiet, and in that silence a man could be seen moving slowly across the stage with a broom in his hands. He was not wearing a suit or shining shoes, instead he wore old clothes, the kind of clothes that showed they had been washed too many times, the kind of clothes someone wears when comfort matters more than appearance. He was the janitor, the one who arrived when everyone else had gone home, and his job was simple: to clean the stage and prepare it for the next performance. He was a single father, a man who had lived through struggles most people in the audience could not imagine, while others spent evenings with their families, watching television or having dinner. He spent his nights sweeping floors, wiping dust from chairs and collecting trash. He did it all so that when the curtain opened the next day, the audience would see a spotless stage. No one ever thought about the man behind that cleanliness. No one ever clapped for him. Yet without his work, the beauty of the show would fall apart. His face looked tired, lines of responsibility etched into his skin, and his eyes carried a kind of sadness. The sadness of a man who once had dreams of his own but had been forced to set them aside. Life had taken away the freedom to choose his own path. He had a child at home waiting for him, and everything he did, every floor he mopped, every chair he polished was for that child. When the world turned its back on him, when opportunities disappeared, his son or daughter became the only reason he kept walking forward. As he worked, he hummed softly under his breath, little tunes that kept him company in the empty hall. Sometimes he looked out at the rows of seats and imagined what it must feel like to stand there under the bright lights, with hundreds of eyes watching, with applause ringing in the air. He wondered if anyone would ever know who he really was, not just the man with the broom, but someone with music inside his heart, music that he had locked away long ago. The stage was big, but he moved slowly and carefully as if he respected the space. He knew that great actors, singers, and musicians had walked there earlier, their names printed on posters and shouted in the news. He would never see his name on a poster. No one would pay money to hear his story, but still he treated the stage with love, sweeping as though it were a temple, polishing as though it were sacred. Sometimes the workers in the theater joked about him. They said he was too serious for a janitor, but they didn't know that for him. This was not just a job, it was survival, it was dignity. It was the way he fed his child and kept a roof over their heads. Every coin he earned had weight, because it meant milk for breakfast, school books, shoes that were not falling apart. The stage did not belong to him, yet every night he gave it a piece of his soul. In those quiet moments when no one was watching, he often spoke softly to himself, remembering the days when he had sat at a piano as a young man, before responsibility had taken over, before he had become a father struggling alone. The music had been his dream. But dreams are fragile. They can shatter when life becomes too heavy. Still, inside him the notes lived on, waiting, hiding, breathing in silence. He sometimes imagined that the stage understood him, that it listened to his quiet humming and his slow footsteps, that it whispered back to him with its echo, telling him he was not invisible, but he knew better. He knew that to the world he was only a man cleaning up after others. And yet, even with that painful truth, he worked with pride, because in his heart he believed that no job was small when it was done with love. That night was no different. As the last of the confetti was swept away and the stage began to shine again, he paused for a moment, leaning on his broom. He let out a long sigh, a sigh that carried all the weight of years spent in silence. He thought of his child asleep at home, waiting to see him in the morning, and for that thought alone he found new strength. He picked up his broom again and continued, one step at a time, one corner at a time, slowly but surely, turning the theater back into a place of beauty. The audience would never know his name. They would never see the effort that went into making the stage ready, but for him that was enough. His child would wake up tomorrow and eat breakfast. His child would laugh and run, and that was worth more than any applause. In the shadows of the empty hall, the single dad kept working, unseen, unnoticed, but with a heart that still held music, waiting for the day it might be heard. When people looked at the single father, they only saw a janitor. They saw a man pushing a broom, wiping chairs, collecting trash, but they never knew the story that lived inside him. Behind those tired eyes there was a dream that had once burned bright, a dream of music, of pianos, of melodies that could touch hearts. As a boy he had fallen in love with the sound of keys. He remembered sitting at an old piano in his school, his small fingers pressing notes with excitement. He remembered how teachers praised his gift, how some even said he could become someone famous one day. Those words filled him with hope. He believed in a future where music would guide his path. But life does not always honor childhood promises. His family was poor, and the piano was a luxury they could not afford. He practiced whenever he could, sneaking into the school hall, borrowing time on instruments that did not belong to him. Still he pushed forward, believing talent and determination could take him far. Then came love, then came family, and then came a moment that changed everything. His partner left, leaving him alone with a child in his arms. Suddenly, the boy with music in his fingers had to become a man with calluses on his hands. He could not play concerts. He could not chase dreams. He had to feed his child. He had to be both mother and father. He had to choose survival over passion. Still, the love for music never died. It was like a candle burning low, almost hidden but never fully gone. When he rocked his child to sleep, he sometimes hummed the tunes he once played, soft and gentle, and his child would smile, as if sensing the hidden gift. When he walked to work in the cold, he often tapped invisible keys in the air with his fingers, his mind creating symphonies no one else could hear. When he passed music shops, he paused for just a moment at the window, staring at the shining pianos, wondering what it would feel like to sit at one again. He never told anyone about this side of him. To the world, he was just a man in old clothes, carrying mops and buckets, but in his heart he was still a pianist. His music lived in silence, waiting, dreaming, aching to be free. Sometimes he laughed at himself, thinking how strange it was, how a janitor could hold such a dream inside. But other times the laughter faded, replaced by sadness, because he knew how close he had once been, and how far away it all seemed now. His child was his strength, his only family, and everything he did was for them. Every coin he earned was used for school books, shoes, food, and sometimes a small toy just to see that little smile. He never complained. He never let the child feel the weight of sacrifice, but inside he wondered if he had buried himself too deep. If he had become invisible, he asked himself, would his child ever know that their father was once full of music? Would they ever know that the man who cleaned stages had once dreamed of standing upon one? At night, when the world was quiet, he sometimes closed his eyes and imagined a different life. He imagined sitting at a grand piano under golden lights, his fingers dancing, the audience silent, moved by his music. In those dreams he was not tired, he was not poor, he was not overlooked. He was free. He was alive, but then he would wake up, and the sound of the alarm clock reminded him of the truth. The stage was for others, not for him. He had to get up, prepare breakfast, pack his child's bag, and head back to the theater with his broom and bucket. Yet deep inside he carried a strange kind of hope. He did not know why, but he believed that music had not left him for nothing. He believed there was still a reason it lived within him. Maybe one day the world would hear it again. Maybe one day his child would hear him play and understand who their father truly was. He never said these words out loud, but they were always there, whispering to him when he felt weak, pushing him forward when his body wanted to stop. To others he was invisible, but within himself, he knew he was more than what people saw. He was a father, he was a dreamer, and above all, he was a man with music in his soul. He just didn't know that soon. Very soon, the world was about to discover it too. That night, after finishing most of his work, the single father noticed something unusual. The grand piano on stage had been left uncovered. Normally, the instrument was protected by a thick black cloth to keep away dust and scratches, but tonight it was sitting there in silence, its polished wood shining faintly under the dim lights. He froze for a moment, staring at it as if it were calling to him. His heart began to beat faster. Memories flooded his mind, memories of the young boy he once was, sitting at a piano with hope in his eyes. He leaned on his broom, debating with himself. Should he ignore it and finish his cleaning? Or should he dare to go closer? After all, it wasn't his piano. He was just the janitor. He had no right, yet the temptation was too strong. His fingers tingled as if they already knew what they wanted. Slowly he walked toward the instrument, each step heavy with both fear and longing. It felt like stepping into a dream, a forbidden dream. When he reached the piano, he stood still for a while, his reflection staring back at him from the glossy surface. He hesitated, telling himself it was wrong, that someone might catch him. But another voice whispered inside, reminding him of the music that had been locked away for so many years. Finally, with trembling hands, he pulled out the bench and sat down. The seat creaked softly beneath his weight. He placed his broom on the floor beside him, as though leaving behind his role as a janitor for just a moment. His hands hovered above the keys. They looked rough now, marked by years of work. But as he stretched his fingers, it was like his body remembered what his mind had forgotten. He pressed one key gently. The sound echoed through the empty hall, Clear and pure, it sent a shiver down his spine. He pressed another, then another, slowly forming a melody. At first it was uncertain, shaky, but then it began to flow. The notes connected, rising and falling like a story told without words. He closed his eyes and the world disappeared. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He wasn't a tired man with worn-out shoes. He was the pianist he had once dreamed of becoming. Every note carried a piece of his heart. Every chord revealed a piece of his journey. He played softly at first, but then stronger, letting the music breathe. The melody was not something he had planned. It came from deep inside, from years of struggle, sacrifice, and hidden love. It was as if the piano had been waiting for him, and he had been waiting for it. What he didn't know was that he was not alone. A stagehand who had returned to check some equipment stopped at the door, surprised by the sound. He expected to see a musician rehearsing, but instead he saw the janitor, the man with the broom sitting at the piano, playing like someone who belonged to another world. Quietly, the stagehand stood still, afraid to break the spell. Another worker soon joined, then another. Word spread quickly through the staff still lingering in the theater. The single father, lost in the music, had no idea he had an audience. He poured his soul into the keys, each note carrying his struggles as a father, his loneliness, his love for his child, his unspoken dreams. His fingers moved with passion, not perfection, but with honesty. And that honesty made the music even more powerful. The empty hall filled with sound echoing off the walls, wrapping around anyone who listened for the first time in years. He felt alive, not because of applause, not because of recognition, but because he was being true to himself. In that moment, he was not invisible. He was not forgotten. He was exactly who he was meant to be, the man who had music in his heart. When the melody finally slowed, and his fingers lifted gently from the keys, silence returned to the theater. He opened his eyes, breathing heavily, and only then did he notice the faint shadows at the edge of the stage. He blinked in surprise, realizing people had been watching. Embarrassment rushed through him. He quickly stood up, almost knocking the bench back. His instinct was to reach for his broom, to hide behind the role the world had given him, but it was too late. They had heard him. They had seen the side of him no one knew existed. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It was full of something he did not yet understand. The man lowered his eyes, ready for scolding, ready to be told he had crossed a line, but instead, the stillness was broken not by anger but by quiet awe. The staff looked at him differently now, as if the man they had ignored for years had suddenly revealed his true self. They would never look at him the same way again, and he could feel it in their eyes. That single moment had changed something. Though he did not yet know how much, his secret was no longer hidden. The janitor who cleaned the stage had just stepped into the light, even if only for a few minutes, and the echoes of his music lingered in the hall like a promise of what was yet to come. The janitor's fingers lifted from the keys and silence wrapped around the theater. He thought he was alone. He thought no one had heard the music that had escaped from his heart. But when he looked up, he saw faces in the shadows. His body froze. His first thought was fear. He was not supposed to be touching the piano. What if they were angry? What if they told him he was fired? His instinct pushed him to grab the broom at his side and pretend nothing had happened. But it was too late. They had seen everything. At the edge of the stage, a young stagehand stood completely still, his eyes wide. He had been on his way to collect some tools when the sound of the piano stopped him. At first he thought a professional musician had returned, but when he stepped inside, he saw the janitor sitting there, playing like someone who belonged to the stage all along. The young man did not speak. He just listened. The music had caught him in its spell. Soon others came, drawn by the sound, a costume worker, a lighting technician, and even a few guests who had been slow to leave the building. They all stopped when they heard the melody. One by one they entered the hall quietly, whispering to each other but never daring to interrupt. The janitor had no idea they were there. He was lost in his own world, pouring out everything he had hidden inside for years. When the music ended and he finally noticed them, his heart sank, his cheeks burned with embarrassment. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to say that he had only touched the piano for a moment, that it wouldn't happen again, but no words came. He just stood up, eyes lowered, gripping the broom tightly as though it could shield him from their stares. But the stares were not cruel. They were filled with surprise, wonder, even respect. For a long time nobody spoke. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that follows something sacred, the kind of silence that means people are still carrying the sound in their hearts. The young stagehand finally broke it, his voice soft. "That was beautiful. The janitor blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came. The workers looked at one another, nodding quietly, some even smiling through watery eyes. The costume worker whispered. "I never knew he could play like that," another said. "He plays better than the performers we had tonight." The man shook his head quickly, waving his hand as if to dismiss their words. He muttered nervously, No, I was just remembering I shouldn't have touched it." "I'm sorry." His voice cracked with shame, but the people did not agree. One of them stepped closer, saying gently, "Don't be sorry, we should be thanking you." The janitor didn't know how to react. No one had ever thanked him for music. They only thanked him for cleaning, and even that was rare. His chest felt tight. He wanted to leave, to escape the strange attention. But at the same time, a part of him longed to stay, to play again, to keep sharing what was inside him. The small group of listeners stayed where they were, careful not to frighten him. They understood something important had just happened. They didn't want to ruin it with noise, they whispered among themselves. "He has real talent. Why didn't we know? We can't let this be hidden." The janitor heard their whispers, and though he tried to ignore them, every word pierced his heart because deep inside, he had wished for exactly this, to be seen, to be heard, to be more than invisible. One of the guests, an older woman with kind eyes, wiped a tear from her cheek. She stepped forward and said softly, "You play with your soul." I felt every note. Her words stunned him. No one had ever described his music like that. It made him feel both proud and vulnerable, as if she had seen too deeply into him. He lowered his head again, whispering, "It was nothing." But his trembling hands told another story. The staff didn't move. They lingered, not wanting the moment to end. The janitor could feel their eyes on him, and though it made him nervous, it also filled him with a strange warmth. For years he had been invisible, just the man sweeping in the background. But tonight, for the first time, people were looking at him differently. They were not seeing a janitor. They were seeing a musician, a man with a hidden life. Slowly he picked up his broom and went back to sweeping. His hands shaky, the audience stayed quiet. Watching him, respecting his silence, they knew they had discovered something rare, something fragile, and they didn't want to break it. He avoided their eyes, embarrassed, but inside him, a spark had been lit. He could not deny what had just happened. He could not forget the looks on their faces, the tears in their eyes, the gentle applause of silence. He did not realize it yet. But that night marked the beginning of something he had never expected. The hidden audience had seen his soul, and once something true is revealed, it can never be hidden again. The janitor who cleaned the stage was no longer invisible. His music had touched hearts, and the echo of it would keep spreading. Even after the last broom stroke was made, the man sat back down on the bench, his body still trembling from the shock of being seen. But something inside him pushed him not to run away this time. His heart was beating fast, yet his hands moved toward the keys as if they already knew the truth, that this was the moment he had been waiting for all his life. He pressed a key softly, then another. The sound floated into the hall again, gentle at first like a whisper, and then it began to grow. This time he didn't fight the emotions that came rushing forward. He let them spill into the music. Every note became a memory. Every chord became a story. He thought of his child, the nights he had stayed awake when fevers burned, the mornings he had walked to school holding a small hand in his, the laughter, the tears, the sacrifices, all of it poured out through his fingers. The melody was not a famous one. It was not written in any book. It was his own, born from pain and love, from years of silence and longing. The audience that had gathered at the edges of the stage listened without moving, their eyes fixed on him. They could feel something deeper than just music. They could feel truth. He was not performing to impress. He was not chasing applause. He was simply speaking the language of his heart, and that honesty gave the music a power stronger than perfection. Some of the listeners felt their throats tighten. Others felt tears slip down their cheeks without even realizing it. As he played, he remembered the nights when he had almost given up. When he had looked at his child sleeping and wondered if he could keep going. He remembered working extra shifts, walking home in the cold, eating less so his child could eat more. All those moments became sound, sorrow turning into soft notes, love turning into tender chords, struggle turning into rising crescendos. The piano became his diary, and every person listening was reading the pages with their hearts. The hall was empty of audience seats filled with tickets, but in that moment it felt fuller than any concert he had ever dreamed of. He felt connected to everyone there in a way that words could never capture. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing with him, carrying his story through echoes. His fingers moved faster now, not from skill alone but from the urgency of release. Years of silence breaking all at once, the music rose higher, filling the space with both pain and beauty. He tilted his head back slightly, his eyes closed, tears glistening at the edges. He wasn't just playing the piano, he was living through it. The keys were not wood and ivory anymore. They were his voice. They were his soul. The people who watched felt humbled. They realized they were witnessing something rare, something pure. One of the staff members whispered to another, "He doesn't just play notes, he tells stories," and it was true. The janitor who had been invisible for so long was showing them his real self. And his real self was extraordinary. Minutes passed, but no one noticed the time. It felt like the music had stopped the clock, and for those who listened, nothing else mattered when he finally slowed down, letting the last notes drift away. The silence that followed was heavy. Not because it was empty, but because it was full of emotions too deep for words. He sat there with his hands resting on the keys, breathing hard, unsure if he had done something right or terribly wrong. He turned his head slightly and saw the audience still there, frozen, many with wet eyes, some with hands clasped together as if in prayer. He quickly looked down, embarrassed. Wiping his own tears with the back of his sleeve, he whispered, "I'm sorry," but they didn't let him finish. Someone shook their head, whispering back, "Don't be sorry." "Thank you." That moment struck him harder than anything. No one had thanked him for his music in years, maybe never. He felt his chest tighten again, but this time not with shame, with a strange kind of relief. He had finally let his music out and it had been heard. For the small crowd, it was unforgettable. They would later tell others about the janitor who played the piano that night. They would say it was not just music, it was life itself turned into sound. Some would swear they had never been moved like that in any theater performance before. The man stood up slowly, his knees weak. His hands still shaking, he reached for his broom again, ready to return to his role. But the eyes watching him told him he could never go back completely. Something had changed, he was not invisible anymore. His music had revealed who he truly was, and even if he wanted to hide it again, the memory of it would remain. As he walked off the stage, the echo of the piano still floated in the air, following him, wrapping around the listeners like a warm blanket. They didn't clap, they didn't cheer, they simply stood in silence. Because sometimes silence is the loudest form of respect. He lowered his head, holding his broom, but deep inside, for the first time in years, he felt light. He felt alive. He felt that maybe, just maybe, his music still had a place in this world. When the last note of his song faded into the air, the theater became silent. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that comes when people are holding back tears. The janitor looked around nervously, his hands still trembling. He wanted to pick up his broom and disappear into the shadows, but he couldn't because everywhere he looked, he saw eyes staring at him. Eyes that were wide, shining, and wet with emotion. One of the stagehands tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and whispered, "That was incredible." The man lowered his head, embarrassed, muttering, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched the piano." He expected scolding, maybe even anger. But instead he saw people wiping their cheeks, some quietly sobbing. They weren't angry at all. They were moved, truly moved. An older woman sitting near the front row dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Her lips trembling, she whispered to the person beside her. "He played with his heart. I felt every bit of his struggle." Another staff member, a young woman from the lighting crew, pressed her hand to her chest and said, "It's like he told his whole life story without saying a word." The janitor heard these words, and they pierced his heart, because that was exactly what he had done. He had poured his life into the music, and somehow they had understood it. The silence stretched for several moments, broken only by the sound of people sniffing and wiping tears. The janitor wanted to hide. He wanted to run backstage and pretend none of this had happened. But he stayed frozen, unsure what to do, and then slowly, something unexpected happened. A few people in the small audience began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, just soft applause, but it grew, echoing through the hall. Not wild like in concerts, but gentle, respectful, like they were applauding not just music, but his soul. He shook his head, whispering again, "Please don't, I don't deserve this," but they didn't stop. Their faces were full of admiration, and some still couldn't hold back their tears. It was the strangest moment of his life. He had been invisible for so many years, a man with a broom who passed unnoticed, and now here he was, standing in front of people who looked at him as if he were something rare, something precious. One of the men who worked backstage stepped closer. speaking softly so he wouldn't scare him. "You've been hiding this talent all along, haven't you?" The janitor shook his head quickly. No, it's nothing. I used to play long ago, but life got in the way." His voice cracked as he spoke. He didn't want pity. He didn't want false praise. But he couldn't deny what had just happened. The truth was on their faces, in their tears. A young girl who had stayed behind with her parents stepped forward, holding her mother's hand. She looked up at him with innocent eyes and said, "Mister, your music made me feel like flying." The janitor's chest tightened. He bit his lip to stop himself from crying. He nodded quickly, unable to speak. Because that simple honesty from a child felt more valuable than anything, the audience remained quiet after the applause faded. No one rushed to leave. They stayed as if glued to their seats, whispering to one another, sharing how the music had touched them. The janitor felt overwhelmed. He didn't know how to handle so many emotions at once. He picked up his broom slowly, as if trying to return to his old self, but deep inside he knew nothing would be the same. His eyes lifted once more to the people around him, and for the first time in years, he saw something in their gaze that he had not felt in a long time. Respect, not the kind given out of politeness, but the kind that comes from true admiration. It scared him, but it also filled him with a quiet warmth. He whispered softly, "Thank you," barely loud enough to hear. But the small audience nodded, some smiling through tears, others still shaking their heads in disbelief. The theater felt heavier now, not because of sorrow, but because of the emotions that lingered in the air. The janitor turned back to the piano, brushing his fingers gently across the keys one last time before closing the lid, as if saying goodbye to an old friend he had finally reunited with. He knew he couldn't stay longer. He had work to finish, floors to clean, lights to check, but in that brief moment, he felt like he had lived an entire lifetime. As he walked off the stage, the silence returned again, but it was not the same as before. This silence was rich, full of meaning. The people who had witnessed his music would carry it in their hearts long after they left the theater. He had touched them in a way words never could, and though he still felt embarrassed and small, he also felt something new, hope. He didn't know it yet, but that night would be remembered by everyone in the hall, not as a show where famous names performed, but as the night a quiet janitor, a single father, sat at a piano and made strangers cry with the truth of his life. And though he tried to tell himself it was nothing, deep inside he knew it was everything. The invisible man had been seen, not because he asked for it, but because his music had made hiding impossible. The night ended quietly, but the memory of the music did not stay inside the theater. One of the workers who had been watching had taken out a phone and recorded a small part of the janitor's performance. It was not planned, it was not professional, but the sound of the piano and the sight of the man sitting there in his worn clothes with tears in his eyes was too powerful not to capture. When the worker went home, he shared it online with only a few words. "The janitor played the piano tonight, and we all cried. At first only friends saw it, but soon those friends shared it with others, and within hours the video spread quickly. People were curious, they clicked to watch, expecting maybe a funny clip or a short tune, but instead they found something different. They found a man pouring his heart into music. They saw his rough hands moving across the keys with honesty. They heard the story inside the melody, and it touched them. Comments began flooding in. "This is beautiful. I can't stop crying. And who is this man? Why isn't he on a stage already?" The next morning, when the janitor woke up to prepare breakfast for his child, he had no idea what was happening in the world outside his small home. He tied his worn shoes, packed a simple lunch for his son, and walked him to school just like every day. People on the street looked the same. Buses rolled past, children laughed. Nothing seemed unusual. But while he was sweeping floors later that day, his phone buzzed with messages from coworkers. "Have you seen it? You're all over the internet when people are talking about you." He frowned in confusion, not understanding. During his break, one of the younger workers showed him the video. His heart nearly stopped. There he was, sitting at the piano, lost in the music, his face raw with emotion. He felt embarrassed, almost angry. "Why did you record me?" he asked. But the young man shook his head and said, "Because the world needed to see you." The janitor didn't know what to say. He wanted to hide, yet he also felt a strange warmth inside, because the comments were not cruel. They were kind, overwhelmingly kind. By evening, local news stations had picked up the story. "Janitor moves theater staff to tears with piano performance," the headlines read. Reporters began calling the theater, asking for his name, asking for his story. People wanted to know who this man was. They wanted to know why someone with such talent was cleaning floors instead of performing on stage. The staff at the theater were proud. They had always known him as hardworking, reliable, but now they saw him as something more. They told others how he had never once complained, how he always stayed late to finish the smallest details, how he worked to support his child alone. And now the world saw that too. People admired not only his music but also his life, his sacrifice, his humility. Some even began to demand that the theater give him a chance. Let him perform properly, one comment read. He deserves a stage, not just a broom. Others wrote messages like, I would pay to hear him. This is what true art looks like. He plays from the soul, not for fame. The janitor was overwhelmed when he read these. He couldn't believe strangers cared so much. He had been invisible for so long, and now thousands of people were speaking his name with respect. For his child, it was even more magical. One of the classmates had seen the video and showed it at school. Suddenly, the boy or girl was no longer just the child of a janitor. They were the child of the man who played the piano and made the whole internet cry. The child ran home with shining eyes, hugging him tightly, saying, Dad, you're famous, he laughed nervously, shaking his head. No, I'm not famous. I just played for a few people. But the truth was he could not deny what was happening. That night, when he returned to the theater, people greeted him differently. The security guard smiled wider. The ticket seller said, I saw your video. It was amazing. Even strangers waiting outside gave him nods of respect. He didn't know how to handle it. He was not used to being noticed. He still carried his broom, still wore the same clothes, but everywhere he went, eyes followed him with admiration. Deep inside, he felt torn. He wanted to stay humble, to keep living quietly for his child, but another part of him, the part that had been buried for so long, began to feel alive again. The musician in him, the dreamer in him. That part whispered softly, maybe this is your second chance. Maybe the music is not finished. The video continued to spread, reaching not only local communities but people across the country, and soon even across oceans. Musicians, teachers, and even some celebrities commented on it. This man plays with more soul than most of us ever could, one famous pianist wrote. Invitations began to arrive. People wanted him to perform, to share his music not just in secret, but on a stage meant for him. The janitor shook his head in disbelief every time he heard about it. He had never expected this, he had never asked for it. He only played because the piano had called to him that night. Yet somehow the whole world had heard his heart, and the world was answering back. For the first time in many years, he walked with his head a little higher, not with pride for himself, but with gratitude that his child would see him not only as a man who cleaned stages, but as a man who carried music inside him, a man worthy of respect. The days after the video spread were like nothing the janitor had ever known. Every morning when he woke up, he still tied the same worn shoes. He still packed breakfast for his child. He still walked to the theater carrying his lunch in a simple bag, but the world around him no longer looked at him the same way. People smiled when they saw him. Neighbors stopped to shake his hand. Strangers whispered as he passed, "That's the man from the piano video." His child walked beside him with pride, their small hand gripping his tightly, their eyes shining as if to say, "That's my dad." At work, the theater felt different too. He was no longer just the man with the broom. Now, every time he entered the building, someone greeted him warmly. "Good morning, maestro," one of the stagehands teased kindly. Another worker clapped him on the back, saying, "We're lucky to have you here." Even the manager who had barely spoken to him before now looked at him with a mix of respect and curiosity. The janitor felt shy under all this attention. He had lived invisible for so long that being seen so brightly was almost uncomfortable. Yet inside his heart something new had begun to grow. A quiet flame. It was not pride exactly. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about finally being able to share what had always been locked inside. It was about showing his child that dreams, even buried ones, can still breathe. He knew he could not go back to being only a shadow, because the music had stepped into the light, and once revealed, it could not be hidden again. One evening, as he finished cleaning, the theater manager approached him carefully. "Listen," the manager said, "we've been talking, and we think people would love to hear you play again. Not secretly, but properly on this stage." The janitor's heart jumped. His instinct was to say no, to step back into the safety of silence, but he looked at the empty piano sitting proudly at the center of the stage, and then he thought of his child. He imagined them in the audience, clapping with joy. His lips trembled, and he finally nodded, whispering, "If people really want to hear, then I will play." Word spread quickly. The theater announced a small concert featuring the janitor pianist. Tickets sold faster than anyone expected. People were curious. Some wanted to witness the man whose music had made them cry through a screen. Others wanted to support someone who reminded them that talent can live anywhere, even in silence, even in the most ordinary lives. The night of the concert arrived, and the janitor stood backstage. His hands sweating, his heart pounding, he wore the same old clothes. He had refused fancy suits. He wanted to be himself, not someone polished for show. His child sat in the front row, eyes glowing with excitement. That sight gave him courage. He stepped onto the stage, and for the first time, the spotlight was on him, not as a cleaner, not as a shadow, but as a musician. He sat at the piano, the same one he had touched in secret, and he placed his hands on the keys. The audience grew silent, waiting. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, then he began to play. The notes flowed like a river, gentle and strong. His music told the story of his life, of sacrifice and pain, of love and hope, of nights spent working so his child could dream. Each sound carried honesty, and the hall filled with it, wrapping around every listener like a warm embrace. People leaned forward in their seats. Some closed their eyes, others let tears roll freely. His child sat frozen, their small face glowing with pride, whispering softly to themselves, "That's my dad." The janitor did not need to look, he could feel it. He could feel their pride shining brighter than the stage lights. When the final note faded, the silence was heavy again, but only for a breath. Then the hall erupted in applause. Not the polite clapping he had heard for others, but thunderous, long, emotional applause. People stood to their feet, cheering, shouting, crying. He sat frozen on the bench, overwhelmed. He shook his head, whispering, "I don't deserve this." But the audience would not let him doubt. Their claps told him the truth. He was no longer invisible. Later that night, when the noise had faded, when the lights were dim again, he walked home with his child, the air cool, the streets quiet. His child looked up at him and said softly, "Dad, you did it. You're amazing." He smiled through his tiredness, squeezing their hand, and whispered, "No, my child, we did it. Everything I played was for you." His child hugged his arm tightly, and in that moment he felt richer than any fame, richer than any prize. The world may or may not remember his name years later, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that his child had seen him, not just as the man who worked hard to feed them, but as a man with music in his soul, a man who never gave up, even when life forced him to hide, and for him, that was the greatest success of all. The janitor still cleaned the theater, still swept floors and polished seats, but now, whenever he walked across the stage, people looked at him differently, not as invisible, but as someone who carried a gift. And sometimes late at night, when the piano sat uncovered, he would sit again, his fingers dancing softly across the keys. Not in secret, but in freedom, knowing that his music had finally found its place in the world. And so his life continued, not perfect, not easy, but filled with dignity, love, and a melody that would never die. For his child, for himself, for anyone who believed that even in the quietest corners greatness can still shine.